The October air had that metallic edge that makes breath feel borrowed, and as the lowering device began its steady grind, a rhythm too precise to belong to grief, I watched the casket descend with a focus so tight I could count the flecks in the varnish, the nickel sheen on the handles, the damp earth clumping against the straps, and I told myself to listen only to the machinery, and Aunt Greta's soft crying, and the pastor's closing, Amen, because I had already survived 3 days of casseroles and condolences, and the oddly fluorescent logistics of death, and I wanted for the length of this descent to be nothing but a daughter saying goodbye. Then Vivian stepped forward in her couture. Black like sorrow could be tailored and timed, and in a voice that preferred microphones to prayer, she announced to 47 members of our family that I was living a lie, and the name my father chose for me became evidence read into the record of a sky that had gone too quiet. I felt the world tilt in the small, treacherous way it does when a curb is lower than you expect, the shock ridiculous and total, and I heard my own voice answer her from somewhere that sounded far away, insisting on truth even as the wind took the edges off my words, while whispers rose around the hill in ripples that sounded like geese lifting from water, and Uncle Theodore's prayer book dropped into the mud with a slap that made people flinch, and my cousin Mallory's fingers found my arm in that immediate, wordless solidarity women practice in emergencies, and the pastor stared at the grass as if a scripture might appear there to tell him what to do, and still Vivian kept talking, flipping open a folder as crisp as her manicure, to display blood types and charts and a medical bracelet she had no right to be holding, building her case with the precision of someone who rehearsed in the mirror until she could wound without blinking. She said Sterling was O negative and I was AB positive, and therefore the math of me could not include him, and she made the word therefore sound like justice. And beside her Dexter stood in his $1,000 suit with the posture of a coronation, his mouth slanting into a smirk he thought looked like adulthood, while he apologized to me with a stretched-out sis that carried the bright, mean pleasure of a boy scraping a fork across a plate. And he mentioned lawyers as if inheritance were a weather system that obeyed his forecast. And I wanted to laugh because the absurdity was shaped exactly like malice, and because my father had taught me to measure people by the effect of their presence, not their claims, and the effect of Vivian's presence was a chill that did not belong to October. I tried to steady myself with the inventory that makes a life, which is to say the ordinary litany that proves love, the bike rides where his hand stayed at the small of my back until I could balance, the Sunday night calls where he listened to third graders, spelling lists as if the Dow depended on them, the Saturday store rounds that smelled like sawdust and oil and possibility, the way his laughter softened the corners of rooms even when the day had been all returns and no thanks, the signature he put under my report cards and birthday cards, and the photo from college graduation that he kept near the cash office printer, because pride for him was a daily utility, not a speech. Vivian's timing stung with the calculation of a strike scheduled for when defense is impossible, and the family, my family, showed its fractures in a dozen tiny betrayals of breath and posture, people stepping toward me or away from me as though love were a contagion they could catch or avoid, and I felt my face arrange itself into the kind of stillness that has fooled hostel rooms since women learned to survive in them, because heat helps the accuser and calm protects the accused, and I told her she had planned this, not as an outburst, but as a diagnosis, and she smiled the way people do when they think a blade looks better than truth, and said she was preserving the legacy for blood, a word she sharpened like cutlery, even as she pretended ethics. Aunt Greta found her voice and cut through the performance with a sentence that smelled like oak and kitchen tables, and years of being the oldest sister who never left anyone on the side of the road. And Uncle Theodore recovered his book and himself, and the pastor made the smallest gesture, half a step back, that told me he understood that what came next did not belong to liturgy, and even the funeral director, who had perfected the art of compassionate invisibility, leaned forward a fraction as if the ritual had paused for the sake of a different kind of rite. And in that pause, a second sound entered the circle, modest and unafraid, the cleared throat of a man who has carried other people's secrets so long, he knows how to lift them without dropping dignity. Eugene Holbrook had been my father's lawyer and friend for longer than my memory can reach without a photo, and he walked from the shade of the oak tree with shoes that seemed to find the dry ground on instinct. His briefcase held not like a prop, but like a trust, and he placed himself between Vivian and me with the respectfulness of a man who understands the geometry of protection. And he addressed her as Mrs. Caldwell in a tone that made the title sound like an indictment, because he used it like a full stop. And then he said that Sterling anticipated this might happen, and the phrase "this exact scenario" pulled the air tighter around us, the way a theater hushes 5 seconds before the curtain goes up. He opened his case and removed a large manila envelope with my father's handwriting on it, the same precise hand that labeled tool bins and grocery lists, and the instruction on the front, to be opened only under circumstances discussed, carried his humor and his gravity in equal measure, and beneath it, in a line that landed in my chest like a lifted shield, he had written, "My daughter Brooke is my greatest achievement," and I swallowed hard because I refused to give Vivian the spectacle of my tears, and because the sentence worked like architecture inside me, building a room where I could stand and breathe without her permission. And in that room, I remembered the last Sunday call. In the warm, ordinary way, he said, "You sound tired, Brookie. Get some sleep." Vivian called it theatrical nonsense, the way people do when evidence threatens performance, and she lifted her folder and claimed medicine as her ally. And Mr. Holbrook did not flinch because he had both medicine and law, and a thing rarer than either, my father's voice. And he set a small silver recorder on top of the envelope so that ink and sound rested together. Twins of authority, and he asked, without raising his volume or ceding his ground, whether the letter should be read or the recording played, and the question hovered in the cold air like a coin whose landing would decide whose version of my name would be spoken over the rest of my life. For a heartbeat, the cemetery became an auditorium, and even the machinery seemed to pause as if grief itself wanted to hear what love had prepared. And I felt the ring of our relatives tighten in not hostility, but hunger for something firm to hold after a week of casseroles that cooled too quickly, and Vivian's fingers whitened on her folder, and Dexter's smirk slid a degree toward confusion, and I lifted my chin because my father had taught me that posture is a message and messages matter, when you are being measured by people who will go home and repeat what they saw, and I heard my own voice, "Steady now, choose the way forward." "Read it," I said, and the seal broke with that small sound that carries miracles, and the pages slid free, and the room inside my chest brightened with a light that did not come from the sky. And just as Mr. Holbrook drew breath to begin, the recorder caught a sliver of sun like an omen, and Vivian took half a step back as if the ground had betrayed her heels, and the casket, held mid-air by straps and ceremony, seemed to wait with us for the first word that would either rebuild or ruin what she had tried to erase. The moment Mr. Holbrook lifted his hands, envelope in one palm, recorder in the other, the hilltop pulled tighter around us, umbrellas drawing close, relatives edging into a rough ring like a jury with no benches, and I watched the air go out of Vivian's posture as if someone had let down hidden seams, while Dexter's smirk faltered into the uneasy half-smile of a man who has trained for a coronation, but suddenly hears the drumline change its beat. And in that hush I made a quiet vow that if my father had seen this coming and built a way through it, then I would not flinch at the doorway he left for me. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, using the title like a gavel. Sterling prepared evidence in two forms, his handwriting and his voice, and the phrasing aimed itself so cleanly at her that I felt the balance tip back towards something resembling order. Notarizations, witness statements, and duplicates at multiple firms followed in calm succession. Legal theater without theatrics. Chain of custody love that spoke my father's language of receipts and redundancies. And when Vivian tried to pivot toward privacy, "This belongs in a conference room." Aunt Greta's answer landed with the weight of a kitchen table verdict. "You made it public. You don't get to dim the lights now." I said, "Read the letter." And the words steadied my spine as the seal surrendered with a small ceremonial rip. His pen strokes stood up on the page exactly as they had on birthday cards and grocery lists, and notes he left on the counter when he opened the store early, and when the first line rose into the cold air. "To my beloved daughter Brooke, and to all present." My name settled back where it belonged, not as evidence for Vivian's folder, but as belonging pronounced by the only voice that had ever mattered to its meaning, and the circle leaned forward like a single body bracing for a wave. "If you are hearing this," the letter continued through Holbrook's careful cadence, "partial truths are being used to harm my child. I prefer whole truths." And I could see Dad at his office desk, the light on the ledger, the way he would read a paragraph aloud to feel where it hit a trap. And I understood that he had not only prepared documents, but fashioned language as a shelter, because men who build hardware stores out of sawdust and patients also know how to build sentences that can hold under weather, and the weather today had been engineered by someone who mistook timing for power. He wrote that he knew about the blood types, that medicine can be accurate and incomplete at the very same time, and that 24 years earlier, when an emergency made certainty a medical necessity, he had sought it without shame. He wrote about notarizations and witnesses, about the copies lodged with counsel so that truth would not be buried under grief or intimidation. And when the letter shifted to the family at large, the parentage across this family is illuminating. I heard a rustle go through the ring that was not wind, and I saw Dexter's neck flush a shade that did not belong to October, and I watched Vivian's eyes flicker toward him with a calculation that could not decide which story to abandon first. She tried to interrupt, because interruptions are the last tools of people who fear the next sentence, but the lawyer's open palm was an elegant stop sign, and even the pastor, who had seemed rooted to ceremony, stepped back a half pace as if to say the liturgy had yielded to testimony. The letter named protection against posthumous character assassination, a phrase so precise it felt like a steel beam hidden inside soft drywall. And I realized my father had not only defended my status, but anticipated the shape of the smear and aimed his evidence where it would matter most, at the cousins who would carry a version of this day home in their mouths. He wrote about love and law sharing a table, about evidence corroborating the life he had lived in front of all of us. Saturdays side by side in aisles that smelled like metal and hope. Sunday calls that checked on my third graders by name. The way legacy is less a will than a practiced habit of showing up when you're tired. And for a second I had to bite the inside of my cheek because grief will surge when love is spoken plainly, and I refused to give Vivian the spectacle she came for, even as a murmur of assent moved through people who had once stood at his counter needing a bolt or a kind word and never left empty-handed. Then the tone sharpened with the quiet authority of a man who has measured boards and men for a living, use of blood as a cudgel, the mathematics of biology raised when convenient and shelved when costly, the reminder that truth is not a part-time ethic. And I watched Dexter stare at the ground as if the grass might offer him a script that canceled the one his mother had rehearsed, while Vivian's smile went glossy and brittle, the way lacquered things look before they crack, and she made one last attempt to reframe courage as indecency, warning that we were humiliating ourselves, which is what people say when the mask they chose is being gently set aside by facts. Holbrook folded the final page with courtroom care and placed it atop the envelope like a promise he had kept on someone else's behalf. The recorder sat beside it, small and purposeful, a second path to the same destination, and he lifted his eyes to the circle, then to Vivian, and finally to me, as if to honor proper order before offering the next decision, and I felt my father's steadiness push at the small of my back again, the way it did on the driveway the day he let go of the seat and I did not fall. Sterling asked that there be a choice, he said, thumb hovering above the brushed metal button while a pallid ribbon of sunlight slid across the device like an underline. And before we proceed, there is a question for this family to answer. And the machinery over the grave pulsed once, as if even steel wanted a better view, and the ring of relatives leaned further in until I could smell rain on wool and the faint mineral breath of fresh earth waiting below. "Shall we begin?" he asked, voice measured, gaze steady. "With what Vivian fears most, or with what Dexter doesn't know?" Before any science or signatures, before a lawyer's cadence or a recorder's click could rescue the truth from the theater Vivian staged, there was the hardware smell of sawdust and the certainty of my father's voice threading through it like a steady line, and in that voice lived a promise that started on our cracked concrete driveway the days. He ran beside my wobbling bike and said, without drama and without doubt, "I'll never let you fall." And the strange thing is that even now, with a casket waiting for the ground to accept what we cannot keep, I can still feel the warmth of his palm at my spine and hear the smile in his breath when the balance finally held. Saturdays were our standing appointment with ordinary holiness, and the Caldwell stores were our cathedrals of small salvations, where stripped screws and stubborn hinges were redeemed by patience and the right tool, and Dad walked those aisles like a man greeting neighbors at a 4th of July picnic, introducing me to regulars with the ritual that shaped my bones. "This is my daughter Brooke. She's going to be a teacher. And the way the words traveled across counters dusted with dry wall powder taught me that belonging is not an abstract noun, but a repeated act, and that a person can be built up by how she is named in public spaces until she stands taller even when no one is watching. We sorted nails by gauge and washers by size and counted out screws into paper cups that wrinkled at the lip, and he told me the origin story that never lost its shine, how Grandpa took $1,000 loan and a bet on his own stubbornness and opened the first shop in a building that leaked when it rained, how reputation works like compound interest when you return a customer's faith with competence, and how trust is the most expensive inventory to carry because it takes up space in your conscience as well as your shelves. And somewhere between the pegboard and the register, my classroom voice was forged, not from education textbooks, but from the way Dad leaned across the counter to make strangers feel seen. When I stood in front of third graders years later and said their names with the same lifted pride, when I crouched beside a desk to cheat the distance between confusion and comprehension, when I called home to praise a quiet victory and not only to report a disruption, I was borrowing his ethic with interest because he taught me that repairs are rarely glamorous and almost always dignifying, and that love, expressed as attention to the small thing that finally lets the door close, can make a person believe in herself long enough to try again, which is as close to curriculum as life usually gets. Vivian came to our life with a polish that glinted under every light and a smile tuned to the pitch that flatters men who work too hard to notice they are being auditioned. And at first I mistook elegance for goodness because both can look like effort, but elegance does not always bother to be kind, and I began to notice how frames migrated on the mantel until my mother's photo slipped from center stage to supporting role, how conversations at dinner grew crowded with questions about valuations and expansion, how harmless suggestions arrived wearing the tone of helpfulness and then lingered like smoke in rooms that suddenly made me cough. Are you sure those Saturday rounds are still a good use of Sterling's time? Dexter learned the choreography quickly because children absorb weather before they study climate, and he could be unfailingly respectful to Dad in any shared space while reserving for me the kinds of remarks that sound like jokes to people who want them to be jokes, the needling about who carries the Caldwell name and who will extend it into a future that loves its logos, and I saw in him not a villain but a boy apprenticed to the wrong reward system, one where attention is currency and loyalty is a costume. Yet his shadow performances still scraped, because even when you know the magician's trick, you can still be startled by the silk. Dad, contrary to Vivian's plan, did not accept a diminished script for me, and his resistance never announced itself with a speech or a slammed door, because that was not his kind of strength. But he kept the early morning store rounds ours by setting the alarm before dawn and leaving a thermos on the counter with my name on a masking tape label, and he kept my room exactly as I left it instead of consolidating space for a home office that could have held more files than my high school trophies, but none of their meaning, and he kept the Sunday night calls like a sacrament that marriage vows do not cancel, asking about my students by name as if he had attendance sheets taped behind his ribcage. There were moments when I watched him look at Vivian with a private calculation that never curdled into contempt, because love is stubborn and so is hope. And I think he kept trying to find the angle that would allow all of us to fit. And I think the ache of it was that fitting us required someone to shrink. And I did not understand, not fully, how much he was lifting until the morning the phone rang with the news. And the store that taught us both about durable goods proved how fragile breath can be when the heart that sponsors it simply stops. And for a week I let bureaucracy distract me from pain until pain decided to collect all its invoices at the graveside at once. If the Hill felt like a courtroom when Vivian performed her indictment, it felt like a home when Mr. Holbrook set my father's handwriting between us and asked which truth we wanted first, because the stores taught us to start with the tool you trust most, and for me that has always been Dad's voice in any form it can reach me. And as the letter prepared to unfurl what he had sealed against bad weather, I stepped inward from the crowd and remembered how he once stood between me and a customer who mistook my youth for incompetence and said, "She knows what she's doing." And later in the truck he grinned and said, "So do you, Brookie." And the grin has stayed parked in my chest ever since. I did not know then, as the record of him prepared to lift its calm through the cold, that love had made him careful in ways he never wanted to advertise, that he had arranged proof to stand where he could not, that he had collected signatures and seals the way other men collect golf trophies, Not for display, but for the day a daughter might need a wall. She didn't have to build while grieving, and I did not know how thoroughly he had mapped the fault lines until I saw Vivian read a sentence that did not suit her and flinch like someone feeling an earthquake start under a house she decorated. 3 weeks before he died, before the hill and the wind and the ring of relatives turned my name into an arena, Dad cooked pot roast on a Sunday night with the slow patience he reserved for things you want to taste right. And he reached across the table and covered my hand with his and said, in the tone he used for decisions that would outlive us, "There are things I need to tell you." And then he squeezed once and almost smiled and added, "But not yet." His hands, rough with work and nicked by a lifetime of box cutters and pallet straps, closed over mine with a pressure that felt ceremonial rather than casual. And in the steam rising from the pot roast he had coaxed to tenderness over a slow Sunday afternoon, he said the sentence that struck a tuning fork in my bones, "No matter what anyone says after I'm gone, you're my daughter." And the words arrived with such gentle finality that the clink of our forks against the plates sounded suddenly like punctuation he had planned all along. The kitchen at the old house was never quiet, even when no one spoke, because the radiator breathed its stubborn heat, and the clock by the pantry ticked like a metronome for ordinary life, and the pot roast sent up its thyme and bay and onion perfume, while the candle he insisted on lighting for company guttered in a saucer that had survived 3 remodels. And I watched the way his shoulders eased when he sat, the way grief was not yet in the room but caution was, the way the table between us held both food and the weight of unspoken plans, and I realized, too late to be brave about it, that this dinner had been placed on the calendar by a part of him that did not believe in accidents. He did not speak in the loud, definitive sentences of men who like to win arguments. He spoke in the slow, practical cadence of someone who knows a hinge's value lives in its quiet work, and he guided me through the first bites and the first stories about customers who came in, needing a bolt and left with a plan, and then he leaned forward and lowered his voice just enough to make the air lean toward him, and he said, I needed to trust Eugene Holbrook if anything ever became confusing or cruel, that the documents I might someday require were already arranged in triplicate, that timing mattered more than volume, and that sometimes truth should be released the way a good craftsman eases a drawer into place, not forced until it splinters. I wanted to laugh off the solemnity because the roast was perfect, and the kitchen lamp threw a golden circle over his plate that made him look 10 years younger, but his eyes held the quiet weight I had seen only a handful of times. Once when Mom's oncologist said the word metastasized, once when an employee relapsed and he had to choose mercy with guardrails, once when he decided to keep the original store open late on Christmas Eve because Mrs. Patterson's grandson needed a wrench that wouldn't wait. And before I could banter him back to ordinary, he repeated my identity to me like a compass he was handing across the table, words he had always lived out now pressed into me as a shield with a handle built for my grip. The temptation to ask whether he was ill arrived like a rogue tide, and I studied his face for clues, the color in his cheeks, the steadiness of his hands as he folded his napkin, the familiar creases that years of squinting at invoices in sunlight had carved into kindness at the corners of his eyes. And when I asked, he dodged with the ease of a man who refuses drama on principle, saying only that he was prepared, that men his age ought to be, that preparation was love expressed as paperwork, and that making a mess for the people you adore to clean up is the one unforgivable selfishness he could not abide. He told me again that love, not blood, built this house and these stores, and every Saturday that had ever smelled like sawdust and WD-40, that the customers who brought him their broken things were family because they had chosen to trust him, that the people on our payroll were family because paychecks are promises, that I was his daughter because he had chosen and kept choosing to be my father from the day he heard my first cry through a hospital wall. And while he spoke, I could feel a new architecture assembling behind my ribs, a framing built from statements that would outlast the voices determined to unmake me. I wanted details, and he offered principles, because principles are what remain when details are contested by people who prefer theater to truth. And though a part of me burned to ask why he was speaking like a man shoring up a seawall against a storm still beyond the horizon, I recognized the look he gave me as the one he used when he'd already decided the responsible sequence. So I honored it and asked the next best question, how I would know when to lean on the structures he had set in place. And he smiled in the small way that lifts only one corner of his mouth and said I would know because ugliness announces itself even when dressed in silk, and because fear makes liars louder. We ate the way people do when talking matters as much as chewing, with pauses that felt like stitches rather than gaps. And he sent me home with enough leftovers to feed me through Tuesday and a flash of his old teasing. Take the gravy boat. You'll only forget it if I don't put it in your hands. And at the door, he pressed his palm against my cheek, the way he used to when I was running a fever, and said, softer than the radiator's exhale, that I should sleep, that he would call next Sunday as always, that I should not worry, and even though worry had already found a chair in my chest, I nodded because daughters are sometimes brave by agreeing to believe what their fathers need them to believe. Driving back to my apartment, I rolled the windows an inch to let the cold cut through the roast's warm smell, and I replayed the evening like a training video, noting each instruction, each subtle emphasis, each sentence that would later unspool into a map. And by the time I pulled into my spot, I had decided to write down everything he had said before sleep could blur it, because teachers know memory is a muscle, and muscles need repetition, and I wrote the words love over blood in my notebook with the pressure that leaves an imprint on the next page, and I underlined Trust Holbrook twice without knowing the number of times I would later thank my past self for her careful hand. I did not know, could not have known, that timing would show its teeth with a cruelty that felt like an error in the universe's math, that 4 days later a phone would ring at an hour when calls only bring bad news, that a voice caned and unfamiliar would say the words massive heart attack with the steadiness of people trained to deliver impossible facts, that they had found him at the original store before opening, sitting at his desk with a photo of Mom and me turned toward him like a companion, and that the drawer where he kept warranties and receipts would also hold the bracelet I had given him on Father's Day, its engraving worn smooth by use, its clasp still set to his wrist size, waiting for a daughter to decide whether to fasten grief or let it breathe. At the graveside blessing, when the pastor's voice softened into that final petition and the wind lifted the edges of the canopy like a sigh, Vivian unsheathed a glossy folder as if it were a blade and waved blood types like a dagger, and the shock of it cut cleaner than any insult, because funerals are where we lay down our weapons and call our memories holy, not where we sharpen charts and aim them at a daughter who has spent 3 sleepless nights making sure the flowers arrived and the hymn list sounded like him. The contrast bruised me in a way I didn't expect, because the church service had been honest and gentle. My voice at the pulpit steadying itself on stories of Saturday rounds and a father who believed customer names mattered more than margins, the choir holding the harmonies he loved, while the grave became a stage for Vivian's ambition, her voice pitched to carry over the damp grass as if volume were virtue, and I felt my eulogy still warm in my throat while hers arrived preloaded with verdicts, a hostile takeover of goodbye. Crowd dynamics are their own weather, and I could feel the temperature drop as pity cooled into doubt, and doubt condensed into calculation. People shifted into clusters the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet, some stepping closer to me as if proximity could register allegiance, others edging back toward Vivian's polished certainty because papers and plastic sleeves look persuasive when grief has made you hungry for something definitive, and the murmur that swept the hill sounded like a verdict warming up. She had props. A printout of my blood donation record from the school drive, Dad's medical alert bracelet held up between 2 manicured fingers, a page of circles and arrows that could have sold arsenic as medicine if the typeface had been professional enough, and she swung them through the cold light in measured arcs, narrating O negative versus AB positive with the relish of a person who thinks science is a cudgel, while Dexter stood beside her in a tailored suit like a punctuation mark that meant inheritance, his expression rehearsed into sympathy laced with triumph. "You've been planning this," I said, not as an accusation but as a diagnosis, because planning has a smell, and hers reached me before her words did. She smiled with that precise arrangement of features that reads as compassion to an untrained eye, and told the assembly she was preserving Sterling's legacy for his real blood, and the way she emphasized real turned the word into a gate with a guard, an invitation for people to sort themselves by biology rather than by the work they had seen my father do in public for decades. Theodore and Greta held their ground like the moral spine of the family we used to be, Theodore recovering his fallen prayer book as if retrieving the value it represented, and Greta speaking in a voice that sounded like the kitchen where we learned not to lie, telling Vivian that truth does not require cruelty and timing is part of ethics. But the pastor, bound by decorum and the awkwardness of refereeing the living, stood paralyzed 2 steps from the casket, caught between liturgy and damage control, as if the right scripture might appear under his shoes if he waited long enough. Dexter, eager to be helpful to whichever side looked like power, began to parrot the language estate lawyers feed to men who believe nouns can crown them: continuity, stewardship, controlling interest. And when he reached the word stores, I felt something inside me recoil, not because the buildings and inventory mattered more than memory, but because he spoke about them as if they were a throne rather than a covenant, as if metal shelving and payroll and Saturday morning advice were an entitlement he had inherited by standing near his mother's certainty. I told Vivian that legacy is not a trophy but a practice, and she laughed the way people laugh when they need the room to agree that kindness is naive. And for a second her satisfaction flashed naked, and I almost pitied how transparent it made her, because the hunger behind it looked like a child who never got dessert and learned to steal sugar. And before I could decide whether pity was a luxury I could afford, the crowd's murmurs turned back toward me when Aunt Greta added a sentence sharp enough to slice the damp air. "You don't get to pick this battlefield and then claim we're indecent for standing on it with you." Through it all, the mechanical hum of the lowering device kept time like a metronome for grief, a reminder that the casket and the man inside it deserved better than our skirmish. And I thought of Dad's Sunday night call from 8 days earlier, the way he had asked about a student who hates fractions and then told me a joke he'd been saving. And I felt the old discipline steady me because he raised me to manage a room. And a graveside is still a room if you refuse to let the loudest voice claim the ceiling. I said I would not surrender my name to a chart presented like theater, and my words did not wobble. And for a heartbeat, the canopy space held a silence that felt less like acquiescence and more like readiness. A shift in posture you can feel even with your eyes closed, and that was the pocket of air where he stepped in, the sound of a throat being cleared with authority rather than irritation, and a polished shoe-finding purchase where mud wanted to own the day. "Mrs. Caldwell," Eugene Holbrook said, standing between us with his briefcase held the way good men carry fragile things. "Sterling said to read this out loud, right now." And he raised the manila envelope so the family could see my father's handwriting across its face. A simple instruction written by the only person entitled to define this moment, and the ring of mourners leaned closer as if drawn by a magnet stronger than scandal. Because grief respects a voice that arrives prepared to tell the whole truth. Notarized, witnessed, time-stamped. The words landed with the click of a deadbolt, and for the first time all afternoon, I understood my father's love as something that could be bound, initialed, and retrieved, not just remembered. Mr. Holbrook didn't perform the list. He delivered it with craftsman's pride. Names of notaries, the dates in the margins, the seal impressions he'd inspected himself. He described duplicates lodged at 3 separate firms in different cities, each with a narrow set of instructions and a final layer that made Vivian flinch. If this matter were contested in any probate forum or via a public statement, impugning my status, a packet would be sent to designated media contacts. It wasn't a threat. It was a contingency plan forged by a man who sold screws and built trust. My father had translated love into evidence, faith into chain of custody. Vivian tried to wedge a protest into the space between clauses, but her timing frayed. "This is grotesque," she said, voice climbing a register that didn't flatter certainty. Sterling would never... Her words dimmed under the collective lean of the family ring. People stepped closer without seeming to take steps at all, as if gravity had thickened around the envelope and the recorder. Even the funeral director, a professional at polite distance, angled nearer by 2 discreet inches, the brim of his hat shading eyes that no longer pretended to be elsewhere. Dexter's posture went technical, hands behind his back, chin lifted, but his composure ran like cheap dye. I could see the stain bleeding at the edges. The letter's first pages closed with the tidy authority of a foreman, and then Holbrook turned to a section marked in Sterling's square hand, Scope of Review. Sterling believed that, when partial truths become weapons, the only responsible answer is the whole truth. He read, "Accordingly, I reviewed relevant medical and legal documentation regarding parentage for the parties now invoking biology as a gate. The hush changed temperature. It wasn't scandal-mongering, it was caution dressed in documentation. I could hear my father in the choice of tone. Never humiliate, but never hide. Holbrook didn't rattle off salacious details. He summarized process, what was examined, why it was necessary, how consent was obtained where law required it. And he named the independent lab retained for confirmatory testing, the chain of custody forms signed, the sample handling protocols, receipts stacked like lumber, squared at the corners. A sentence arrived with the calm edge of a ruler. In one instance, Holbrook read, the claimed paternity is a mathematical impossibility. The phrase dropped into the ground between Vivian and Dexter like a plumb bob seeking true. I felt Dexter's attention flick hard to his mother, that quick, young look a boy gives the person who taught him which way is up, and for a beat the man-suit failed to disguise the question in his face. Vivian's answering smile tried for unbothered and landed on brittle. This is beneath you, Eugene, she said, collecting hauteur like a shawl. Family business should not be litigated in mud. Greta exhaled a soft, incredulous sound, the kind that says, you brought us to the mud and now you complain about the ground. I found the edge of the casket with my left hand and kept it there. The varnished lip was cool and clean, and the texture beneath my fingertips steadied the room inside my ribs. Grief is a moving target. Wood is not. While Holbrook continued, I listened to how he sounded when he refused to be baited. No spikes of outrage, no contempt, just the discipline of a man honoring a friend's exact instructions. He described release triggers with the same neutrality he would use to read a warranty clause. Any public contest of the will, any formal allegation regarding my status, any attempt to alter business ownership through claims of blood alone, and the sealed packets would open in sequence. First to the court, then to the press, then to the board of the regional hospital that had authenticated signatures on an older DNA test, each rung designed not to punish but to prevent manipulation masquerading as grief. The ring of relatives had settled into listening. The wind, rude all afternoon, lost interest. I thought of Dad's Sunday night voice explaining returns and margins, how he'd say numbers are just stories that agree with themselves, and I realized this was the same thing, only with lives, a full story made of facts that no longer bent under someone's will. Vivian's file, so glossy at the start, now looked thin, and she knew it. She leaned toward the pastor as if custom might deputize him to stop time. He took a small step aside, placing decency where it belonged, on the side of the man who came prepared to tell the truth in full. Sterling asked that the family be protected not just from lies, but from theater, Holbrook read, flipping to the final page. When facts are known, performance can end. He let that line rest. Then he placed the letter on the closed lid of the briefcase and shifted his hand to the recorder. Vivian's jaw set. Dexter stared at the ground in the precise way men look when they no longer trust their feet. Somewhere behind me, Theodore whispered a prayer, the kind you say when hope and dread have to share a bench. I kept my palm on the casket and let memory anchor me, the exact weight of my father's hand on my shoulder when he said I had handled a difficult parent at school with grace, the way he wrote my name on painter's tape and wrapped it around a thermos because he did not believe love should leave you hunting for it, the way he fixed a hinge in silence, not to avoid talking, but because some truths are best said with the right tool. If he had asked for this to be read today, then this was an act of repair, not revenge. Vivian tried one last angle. Eugene, this is indecent, she said softly, as if volume could summon dignity. The man hasn't even... She didn't finish the sentence because even she could hear its poverty. Indecency, Holbrook replied, almost kindly, is what happens when grief is exploited and a daughter is ambushed. He rested a fingertip on the recorder's play button, then looked up, not at me, but at Vivian, because the choice he was about to offer belonged to the person who had chosen spectacle. His voice found that courtroom timbre again, respectful and immovable. Vivian, he said, shall we read about Rex, or shall we play Sterling's voice? The recorder gave a soft breath of room tone, that faint electric hush you only notice when you're waiting for something that can't be unsaid, and then my father's voice, clear, unshakable, carrying the grain of his office walls and the weight of his careful cadence, filled the hilltop with the simplest greeting in the world. Hello, everyone. In an instant I saw him at the old desk by the window that overlooks the loading bay, invoices squared under a paperweight, family photos in their stubborn places, the bracelet I engraved for Father's Day, catching the strip of morning sun that once warmed his coffee. He did not clear his throat or apologize for the recording, because men who fix things don't preface repairs. He went straight to the wound Vivian had chosen and named it with the steadiness of someone who refuses to whisper what others shout. Vivian, he said, you and I both know that Tuesday yoga wasn't yoga, and that Rex, the personal trainer you continued to see after we married, wasn't a rumor. The name landed like a dropped wrench on concrete. Somewhere to my left, a cousin gasped through clenched teeth, and the wind, rude all afternoon, flattened as if to listen better. He laid out the trail like a foreman unspooling a chalk line. Our credit card statements labeled your payments as fitness training, recurring on the 1st and the 15th. The transfers to an account ending in 4472 matched that schedule, and the memo line, your hand not mine, read Rex. He did not gloat. He cataloged. When I asked, you called it self-care. When I pressed, you said privacy. When I verified, you called me unromantic. Each sentence fitted into the next with the measured snugness of a dovetail joint, proof living where theater dies. He did not spare Dexter, and he did not shame him either, because a father who has chosen love above blood knows how to separate deceit from the deceived. Dexter, he said, and I felt the entire ring of relatives tilt toward the boy who had costumed himself as a man all morning. This will not change that I tried to be your father, and I meant it every day. Then came the figure that tuned the hill to a single stunned note. During your college sports physical, with the physician's cooperation and a lab that respects confidentiality, we added a discrete paternity panel. The probability that I am your biological father is 0. The word 0 does not echo when it is spoken without malice. It settles like a plum weight, finding true. There was a ripple of fabric and breath, umbrellas creaking as hands tightened, and then Dexter's voice, stripped of his practiced baritone, rose raw and bewildered. Mom? The single syllable skittered like a dropped marble across granite and found no hand to stop it. Vivian's mouth opened on a smile she could no longer control, something glossy and frightened coiling behind her lips. She did not answer her son. My fingers found the varnished edge of the casket and held. Dad kept the line taut between grace and fact. Son, he said, and the word son did not wobble. Biology did not decide whether I showed up to your games, whether I taught you how to shake a customer's hand, whether I kept a fund in your name when it would have been easy to say no. I showed up because I believe boys deserve men who keep coming back, even when it's hard. That conviction does not change today. The truth does. I heard Aunt Greta's breath hitch, not in judgment, but in recognition of a generosity that could have looked like denial if he hadn't paired it with spine. Then he turned back to Vivian with the same steady voltage that had powered his letter. I'm not angry on my own behalf, he said. I'm angry for the way you sharpened partial truths into weapons and aimed them at Brooke, who has never once lied about who she is. He cited dates, not insinuations. The calendar weeks when Tuesday yoga moved to Wednesday after I began teaching an evening literacy class in the church basement. The 3-day stretch when our home security footage captured her on the phone, telling Rex that she would make sure the biological daughter got nothing after the old fool died. The USB copy he left with Holbrook because insurance is a love language too. The circle adjusted its shape as if the earth itself made a small decision. People who had drifted toward Vivian's glossy charts edged back toward the sound of evidence spoken without venom. The funeral director, whose profession requires discretion like oxygen, stood a fraction closer than neutrality permits. The pastor's eyes lifted from the grass and found something to fix on that looked like right order, reasserting itself in the face of spectacle. I thought of my classroom in late May, when a child finally reads a sentence cleanly and the air changes in relief. This was that, only carved into adult silence. My father did not let the ledger close without a confession of complexity, because he believed in truth like he believed in properly rated anchors. Choose the one that holds. I stayed married, he said, because I made vows and because I hoped you might choose a different kind of life. I stayed for Dexter, who needed steadiness even when he did not believe he needed it. But I did not stay blind, and I did not leave Brooke undefended. It was not a flourish. It was a final tightening of the screws that keep a door from sagging under weather and time. Vivian tried to laugh and found no audience for the sound. "This is a grave, Sterling," she said into air that did not belong to her, forgetting he could not hear. The recorder continued with the implacable mercy of a man who understood how to speak once and be understood later. "For those concerned with blood," he said, "you should know that I am O negative and Brooke is AB positive. That fact is accurate. It has also been misused today to tell a story that is not true. Facts require context, so let us have the whole of it." Every body in the ring leaned forward as if tethered, a single human hinge waiting for the door to swing on truth's pin. The wind returned, curious, then held its breath. Dexter pressed knuckles to his mouth, a boy again. I felt the wood under my palm, cool and loyal. Over the small speaker, my father's cadence shifted. Not harder, only closer, like he'd scooted his chair an inch toward the microphone to carry us through the last dark hallway into a lit room. "Now," he said, unmistakable and calm. "About Brooke being AB positive while I'm O negative." The recorder didn't change volume, just temperature, as if the voice coming through it stepped from daylight into a room where the truth had been waiting patiently. "Brooke is AB positive," Dad said, steady as a level laid against a frame, "and I am O negative, which some people will tell you ends the conversation. It doesn't, because facts without their context are just tools in the wrong hands." He let a breath ride the speaker, not reluctance, but care. "The context begins with Angela. My wife was adopted at birth. The father who raised her, the man we buried with gratitude, was A positive. Her biological father, whom Angela found during cancer treatment when medical history mattered, was named David Brennan, and he was AB positive." The hilltop tipped towards stillness, as if every root under the grass was listening. I felt it in the fine bones of my ears, that pressure change a teacher recognizes in a classroom when comprehension finally lands. He kept going the way he taught me to explain a repair to a customer, showing the parts and then the fit. "When Brooke was 8, he said, she wrecked her bicycle, and the ER needed to know what we didn't. I remember praying in a corner that smelled like antiseptic and fear, and I remember a resident asking about blood types with a calm I didn't feel. In that moment, we confronted what you're hearing now. Biology is not a straight line when adoption redraws the map." I was back under those two bright lights, woke by the rhythm of the EKG that hopped like a skittery bird, Dad's hand finding my foot beneath the hospital blanket because it was all he could reach. The ceiling tiles made constellations he named to make me smile, and when I slept he prayed under his breath, saying my name like a steadying chant. Years later, when Angela's oncologist said family history could help, the recording continued, Angela found Brennan through a narrow trail of paperwork and a social worker who still believed in reunions that do more good than harm. He was AB positive. He was not a father, not in any way that counted for her, but he was a fact. Angela asked me to keep that fact away from Brooke until there was a reason to bring it close. She wanted our girl raised by love, not by tangled roots she never asked for. The words brushed my ribs the way a warm hand checks for fever, protective without apology. Mom's voice rose in me with the low laugh she used when a recipe worked, and I understood in the quiet that followed how completely Dad had honored her choice. Tell the truth when it serves the child, not when it serves the storyteller. Holbrook, who knew when to let a voice fill a room and when to add a page to the record, raised the sheet enclosed in a clear sleeve. The plastic flashed a thin bar of light. "For those concerned with proof," Dad said, not sharp, just done with. "Cruelty." We did a paternity test after that ER visit for medical reasons. We kept it private because it was nobody's business. The certified result is here. Brooke is my daughter with a 99.98% probability. In the living circle of our family, oxygen redistributed itself. I heard it as a soft chain reaction of breaths that had been rationed and could now be spent. Vivian's folder, once a weapon, lost its gleam in my eyes. The numbers she loved to wave had context now, which is to say they had lost their usefulness to people who prefer damage to clarity. Holbrook's tone didn't gloat when he said, "Certified and sealed 24 years ago, chain of custody intact, issuing hospital and lab signatures present." And he turned the page so the nearest relatives could see the embossed mark and the tidy squares of Sterling's signature next to my mother's looping hand. The pastor took one step closer, like a man reminded that sacraments and signatures both guard what is sacred in us. Uncle Theodore's mouth formed a thank you without sound. Aunt Greta's shoulders eased as if a stone she'd carried from the church to the grave finally understood it could stay on the ground. Dad's voice returned, carving away the last refuge of doubt. "I'm not interested in humiliating anyone," he said, and it sounded like a door gently closed. "I'm interested in ending a narrative that tried to unmake my daughter at her father's grave. If you have sided with the loudest voice because you were scared, I forgive you. If you have swung documents like blades, you should put them down now before you cut yourself again." I didn't know breath could feel warm inside a cold afternoon, but it did. What he handed me through that tiny speaker was a roof. I found the casket's edge with my palm and felt the varnish under my fingertips, like a finish he would have critiqued kindly. Good coat, smooth lay, no drips, because craft mattered to him in grief as much as in business. The ring around us altered shape without anyone moving much. People who had leaned into Vivian's certainty leaned back toward the sound of something older and sturdier, and in their faces I saw the moment customers decide to trust a salesman, not because his pitch is slick, but because he knows where the studs are behind the drywall. Dexter's jaw worked as if he were learning how to keep it from shaking. He didn't look at me. He looked at his mother as if she were the only door in a room that had stopped pretending to contain a hallway. The funeral director smoothed the brim of his hat and stood as witness, not as vendor. Somewhere a crow called and didn't get an answer. Then my father did what he always did after teaching. He anticipated the next manipulations and locked them out. "Because partial truths attract edits," he said. "A home security clip that Vivian tried to delete exists in 3 places. One with Eugene, one in my safety deposit box, and one lodged with the district attorney for delivery in the event of any suspicious act or public defamation." The sentence ended with a click as soft as a glove being set on a shelf, and in that gentle sound lay the promise that what came next would leave no more air for spectacle. The recording ended with a soft mechanical click that felt louder than the choir had sounded inside the church, and for a breathless beat even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if trying to decide whether decency required silence, until Vivian stumbled backward through the ring of umbrellas, heels slashing the wet grass, hand fishing for the Mercedes key fob she had kept like a talisman in her coat pocket, and she fled before the casket touched soil, a dark silhouette retreating down the hill while the funeral director, God bless his training, gave a tiny nod to the operator, who resumed the careful descent, as though dignity could be braided back into the afternoon if we just kept doing the right next thing. Dexter did not move at first, his face emptied of the smirk he had practiced and the authority he had borrowed. Standing so still, he looked airbrushed onto the scene, until some private dam in him broke and he whispered, "Mom," not sharp with accusation but thin with a child's bewilderment, and then he jogged after her, shoes slipping on the hillside, eyes darting between the path she carved toward the parking lot and the circle of relatives who had abruptly remembered how to look away when shame needs privacy. And when they were gone, the crowd drifted closer to the casket unprompted, a human instinct toward closure reasserting itself, hands taking roses, the pastor recovering his prayer like he'd set it down on a shelf and could retrieve it without breaking it. What astonished me was how easily reverence returned once spectacle left. Aunt Greta pressed a rose to the polished lid with the tender finality of women who have folded flags and fitted quilts and kept families from unraveling. Uncle Theodore cleared his throat and said a line about mercy that sounded worn enough to be trusted, and even the cousins who had leaned toward Vivian's documents now leaned toward the work of goodbye, which is slower and harder and heavier than accusation. And when the straps rose empty at last, the funeral director lifted his hat the way men used to do when a woman entered a room, and the cemetery exhaled. Not relief exactly, but relief's dignified cousin. Within a week, the house told the truth about what kind of marriage we had been living around. Movers came at 9 on Tuesday with a clipboard and matching shirts, and they packed calculation into boxes labeled with expensive words: china, crystal, objects, while leaving behind the grocery store frames and the chipped mug that said, "World's okayest cook," which had always been Dad's private joke, and therefore the only thing that mattered. and by afternoon, a black SUV with Nevada plates idled at the curb while the lead mover carried a jewelry case that had required 3 signatures and 1 raised eyebrow, and I signed where they pointed because signatures are just production stills from a movie that is already over. The first night without the canopy of funeral logistics dropped like a stage curtain, and the phone rang long after decent people are supposed to be done making requests, and Dexter's voice came through the line, roughened by crying he had not staged for an audience, telling me he hadn't known about Rex, hadn't known about the DNA, hadn't known about the recordings, that he had believed the blood talk because it made him feel like he belonged to a story that would always pick him first, and he kept apologizing in loops that tangled around themselves until I interrupted with the ethic Dad raised me on, which is to say the ethic that says remorse is not a conclusion but an entry fee. I told him the door could be unlatched but not unguarded, that if he wanted to stay near Sterling's name, he would have to carry it rather than wear it, that I would not reassign the past, but I could renegotiate the future, and the quiet on the line felt like a man laying down the weapons he inherited, and stretching fingers he had not used for work that wasn't acting, and we agreed on a Monday start at the original store because the original store knows how to sort theater from labor, and because grease under the nails is hard to counterfeit when you plan to keep using your hands. He showed up in a plain gray t-shirt and boots that were too new and an expression that did not know how to be brave yet. And I put him with Jorge in receiving because Jorge is allergic to nonsense and because the back room will teach you inventory and humility faster than any seminar. And by lunch he had learned the names of 3 customers who never go through the front door, only the side because habit is a second skeleton. And by Thursday he had stopped wincing when the pallet jack squealed, and by the end of week 1 he had asked me how to reset the labeler without looking like he was asking me to grade him, and I nodded in a way that told him I had noticed the progress without stapling a ribbon to it. Trust did not turn up like a paycheck. It arrived in installments that looked like sweeping the sawdust pile fully rather than into the corner, like staying late to break down boxes without needing an audience, like apologizing to Ms. Ortiz for assuming she needed help lifting the bag of cement, when what she needed was the kind of respect that asks first. And I watched the crew recalibrate around him the way teams do when someone decides to earn his place instead of declaring it. Kinks ironing out day by day until the nickname Dex sounded less like a brand and more like a man you could send to the hardware wall for quarter-inch lag screws and trust him to come back with the right bin on the first try. We did not become friends by saying we would. Friendship budded in the obiettizi aisles like the hardy kind of plant that thrives under fluorescent lighting, watered by repetition and the tiny courtesies that say, "I see you trying," and after 2 months he knocked on the office door at closing with a question about vendor minimums that turned into a conversation about how you apologize for the ways you were taught to defend yourself. And he said the line about blood not making a family like he had, found it printed on the inside of his own wrist. And we both looked at the bracelet Dad kept in the desk drawer because I couldn't bear to take it home yet, and we didn't say anything because sometimes silence is the most honest way to agree. When the fog of winter finally loosened its damp fingers and the stores started stocking bags of seed and bright tools that looked like hope, he asked me to dinner at the house because he wanted to talk somewhere that wasn't fluorescent, and he brought takeout from the diner where Dad liked the meatloaf, and we ate at the kitchen table that still believed in us, and his hand shook only a little when he reached into his jacket, slid an envelope across the wood, and said he had found it taped under the false bottom of the top drawer in the mahogany dresser Vivian had forgotten in her hurry, an envelope addressed in Sterling's square hand to Dexter, with a date from 2 years ago and a line beneath the name that changed the temperature of the room. "Open when you're ready." In Dad's handwriting, the square, tidy script that never wasted a stroke, the first line reached across the years and set the table with something sturdier than meatloaf. "Biology doesn't define us. I chose to be your father." Dexter read it aloud, then lowered the page as if the sentence weighed more than paper, and I watched the tendons in his hands stand out the way they had when he first learned to lift lumber properly, palms under, back straight, ego set down somewhere safe. We sat at the kitchen table where Sterling had taught budgets and mercy in the same sitting penciling figures in the margins of grocery lists, while reminding us that numbers are only decent if they make room for people. "Dexter," the letter went on, "I began choosing you before I knew how much choosing you would cost me. No one tells a man that love is a line item and a discipline. Consider this the ledger of what I saw. The ledger began in bullets Sterling wouldn't have called bullets. He would have called them sightings. I caught a glimpse of who you are when you stayed after closing to stack bags of salt for winter without being asked, when you lugged them for Mrs. Ortiz and never tried to make it look like a favor she owed you for. When you thought I wasn't looking, you slipped the new stock boy a pair of gloves after he split his knuckle and tried to hide the blood. When your science project blew up the garage and you stood there with your eyebrows singed off, you still told the truth before I asked for it. The list didn't flatter. It cataloged, and as Dexter read, his mouth folded at the corners like a man surprised by evidence that refuses to be argued down. He swallowed and kept going. You resisted me, and I blamed your mother, then myself, then whoever had the nerve to love you least that week. But I never stopped taking inventory of your better moments. I never stopped stocking the shelves of my patience with what I knew of your goodness. Character is chosen daily. Love is staying when it's hard. I stayed. Across from me, the man who had been a rival for square footage in our father's house and for oxygen at his grave turned into a son mid-sentence, and I realized how devastatingly simple Dad's ethic really was. Do not let a child's worst day be the only story you store about him. The letter shifted registers, as if Sterling had leaned back in his chair and rested his forearms on the table we were sharing. There will be days you want to put my last name on like a jacket and call that warmth, he wrote. Find a broom instead. Sweep a corner no one claims. That's how men become the kind of fathers boys need. Dexter let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, and I remembered how he'd shown up the previous week at 7:15 without being scheduled because he'd heard Jorge was short-handed. He swept the receiving bay without looking up for approval. He found the broom. Sterling's attention to the unglamorous had always been the point. I noticed when you returned an overpayment and didn't keep the extra 10 for gas. The letter read, and when a customer barked at you and you remembered to ask what problem they were bringing with them from another room that had nothing to do with our store. I noticed when you learned the names of the roofers, not just the contractors who signed the checks, and when you stopped calling Brooke sis like the word was a dare. I felt that one land, a private shame and a private healing share the same house in the body. Dexter's voice cracked on the next paragraph. If you are ready to be a Caldwell in practice, not just in print, Dad wrote, you will make mistakes that cost money and pride. You will apologize without theater. You will keep the apology company by doing the next thing right. You will thank the person who corrected you. I will be proud, not because you finally carry my blood, because you never did, but because you carry the weight I carried, with your back straight and your palms under. By the time he finished, Dexter had set the letter down and pressed 2 fingers into his eyes as if to keep the present from flooding. We didn't move for a stretch. Then something unclenched between us, a fence post hugged out of ground that no longer wanted to hold it. We began to function like siblings in the way that matters most, without needing to announce it. At the store, he asked Jorge to check his pallet stacking for safety without pretending it was a joke. He miscounted fasteners by a decimal place, owned it, fixed it, and stayed late to make sure the order would still meet the contractor's morning pickup. When Mr. Patel, the customer who believes volume is persuasion, lit into him about a back-order tool, Dexter didn't call me for a rescue. He looked up alternatives, offered a loaner, and walked the man to the truck with the kind of patience that keeps customers and keeps your soul. The crew saw it before they said it. Accolades arrived in the language of the shop. Someone leaving a cup of coffee near his clipboard during a long unload, a joke that included him without testing him, Jorge handing him the key to the cage and saying, "Lock up, man," for the first time. Acceptance didn't arrive on a trumpet. It showed up looking like trust that stubbornly survives the next day and the day after. We reread the last paragraph twice. I don't know if you'll ever see this, Sterling had written, but if you do, know that I kept it not because I doubted your worth, but because I believed in your timing. Some letters should wait until the reader catches up to the truth inside them. The signature, Sterling Caldwell, sat to the right of a tiny smear of oil that felt like an artifact from his pocket, proof that even letters couldn't escape the work. I folded the pages along their old creases and slid them back into the envelope while Dexter stared at the bracelet in the drawer, as if it might warm in his hands if he held it long enough. The house had gone dusk quiet, and for once the quiet felt earned. We were rinsing plates when tires hissed on the driveway and headlights brushed the kitchen wall with a polite warning. A familiar knock followed. Two short, one long. The sound of a man who never arrived without purpose. Eugene Holbrook stepped into the doorway with his hat in his hands and the look he wore when he had been entrusted with one more inch of our father's map. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, eyes taking in our faces and the envelope on the table, "but I promised Sterling I'd deliver a note at the right time." He set a small sealed packet beside the salt shaker, Sterling's handwriting square and spare across the front. "For my children, to be opened on the 5th anniversary of my death." On the headstone we chose the words that refused to be argued with. "Beloved Father, love makes family." And a year later we bring yellow roses and fewer regrets. The kind of fewer that comes from doing hard things slowly and in the right order. The hill has learned our footsteps. We brush away the grass clippings, set the stems in the small bronze vase he would have called adequate, and stand side by side in a silence that doesn't punish. I tell him about my class, the third graders who arrived in August with shoelaces untied and a ferocious insistence that fractions are personal attacks, and how on Fridays we do repair hour, where broken crayons get taped and bad moods get named, and we practice returning what we borrowed better than we found it. It's the store ethic, repurposed for a classroom, legacy as muscle memory. Saturdays remain our ritual circuit through all three stores, a choreography of familiarity that keeps grief from hardening into a museum. We start at the original shop because that's where the floorboard near aisle 4 sings when you step on it, and where the sunlight cuts the counter at 8:17 a.m., like a habit. Dexter manages that location now without needing to announce it every 5 minutes. He remembers names, roofers, retirees, teenagers who swagger until they ask for advice, and he practices patience in the Sterling way, which is to say he treats irritation like weather and doesn't take it personally. When Mrs. Patel's faucet finally surrendered, he didn't sell her the high-end replacement. He sold her the valve that would keep the rest of the month affordable. Profit matters, people matter more. Employees catch what leaders practice. We set guardrails early because peace without structure is a nap, not a plan. The prenup held, the estate settled without a single emergency hearing. The funds shifted where the will told them to shift, and receipts did what receipts do when liars get loud. They stood up and refused to move. Holbrook said he had never seen such neat paperwork in a family that had just survived a public ambush, and I told him he had never met a man who treated love like a ledger that needed to balance nightly. We fenced the boundaries tight and posted kindness at the gate. Vivian stayed gone. The absence felt less like victory than like the air after a storm, raw, a little metallic, breathable. Dexter began therapy on a Tuesday because the clinic had an opening, and he had finally run out of reasons to postpone his own repair. The first week he reported back like a man who thinks vulnerability requires documentation. We talked about triangulation. We talked about parentification. We talked about how control dresses up as care. By month 2, he stopped returning with jargon and started returning with choices. He named emotional abuse without flinching, not to perform pain, but to root around it. He recognized that his mother had used him as a mirror, and he had tried to be the reflection she wanted, and that I had been a rival in a story he didn't write. Then he did the quietest, loudest thing. He chose us back. He apologized to Jorge for the week he acted like supervision meant superiority. He apologized to me for every sis he weaponized. He apologized to himself for believing love is a contest you win by taking. The bracelet lives in the office drawer, still, face down on the felt so the engraving doesn't catch on pens. I handle it like a small tool you only use when the job requires the right weight. Some Saturdays I fasten it to my wrist before opening and let the metal anchor me to the counter where he used to. Lean when a customer needed a second to find words. Other Saturdays I leave it in the drawer and carry him another way, through the script I use to de-escalate a complaint, through the way I slide a free pack of screws into a bag when the budget is tight and the job will stall without them, through the phone call I still want to make on Sunday nights, the one he promised he'd keep until the signal failed. A month after the funeral, Holbrook delivered the private letter Dad left for me, folded like a pocket map and tucked into an unremarkable envelope so no one would mistake it for a bill. I read it in the kitchen at 11:06 p.m., the stove light haloing the paper. Legacy is trust, service, chosen kin, he wrote. If our stores fail to teach that, sell them. If they teach it, keep them humble. Remember that the people who say blood is everything often mean they are afraid of building anything. He wrote that Mom's adoption was a story of abundance, not deficit. He wrote that love is mostly logistics wrapped around tenderness. And he wrote, in a hand steadier than any grief I've ever known, that I would know I was living the legacy if the people who worked for me felt safer at closing than opening. I taped that line inside the cabinet where we keep the coffee filters. It's a ridiculous place for scripture. It's also perfect. Store culture shifted the way seasons do. So slowly you might miss the first leaf if you're not paying attention, and then all at once. Jorge began leaving written shout-outs on the backroom whiteboard for small kindnesses. Dex stayed late for Ortiz pickup. Tasha caught mislabeled bolts before they cost us a return. Brooke did the math on vendor minimums and saved us shipping. The jokes that used to test Dexter's skin now included him without drawing blood. The part-timer who's pre-med asked if she could shadow our ordering system because it feels like triage without panic. We laughed, then wrote her a new checklist. The stores breathed easier. So did we. When I visit my classroom after hours, I catch my reflection in the reading corner window and think of the recorder, the letter, the bracelet, the totems that steadied a year I would not have survived if evidence hadn't offered me a hand. I teach my students a small ceremony before tests. They place a hand flat on the desk, feel the surface, and say, I can stand somewhere solid. It's corny. It works. Adults need rituals too. Mine are these circuits. Classroom to counter, counter to grave, grave to kitchen table, each one tightening the bolts on a life we're building without pretending grief should be finished by now. On the headstone, the line does not fade. Beloved Father, love makes family. It's not a boast, it's an instruction set we keep rereading. We straighten the roses, touch the cool granite, and turn toward the truck because Saturday still needs doing. On the way down the hill, the gravel crunches under our boots. And Dexter asks if I remember how Dad used to say, time is a tool when you respect it. I do. Respect is the hinge that keeps the door from sagging. That evening, as we close the original store, headlights sweep the front windows and a familiar silhouette steps through the glass door with a knock that has become its own reassurance. 2 short, 1 long. Holbrook sets his hat on the counter and looks at the bracelet resting in the tray beside the register. You've earned a quiet year, he says, and then softer, as if his voice knows how to hold a future without bruising it. When you're ready, on year 5, the final letter will open a door. The 5th year letter waits like a key on a high shelf, visible if I stand on my toes, out of reach if I pretend I'm tall enough already. And every day we grow a fraction closer to it, stacking honest work like a step stool we refuse to wobble. The stores still smell like sawdust and hope in the way only places that fix things can, the way WD-40 and coffee and new lumber mingle until the air itself suggests improvement. We are rebuilding meaning, not just margins, repairing a cracked customer counter instead of replacing it, because the crack carries stories. Letting a child trade pocketed washers for a free paint stick so he learns the math of mercy. Training a new hire to say, what are you making? Before, here's what you need. Because usefulness begins with listening. Our chosen family manifesto isn't a poster on a wall. It's a set of habits that can be audited. We sweep the aisles before we sweep our grievances. We confirm facts before we confirm our feelings. We treat the crew like kin not because payroll requires it, but because sunlight does. Everybody grows when they're not bracing for shade. When a delivery driver showed up late and flustered after a double shift, Dexter walked the dock with him instead of logging a complaint, and I watched a man who once calibrated his value by proximity recalibrate it by service. We keep telling the team the truth my father lived. Love is logistics wrapped around tenderness, and if we do the logistics with care, the tenderness arrives on time. The horizon's cleaner now. Vivian is silent, not in the threatening way of a storm-gathering power, but in the exhausted way of weather that has finally blown out. A single unsigned birthday card reached Dexter in March. No return address, a short line about hoping you're well, and a check folded behind stiff paper. He didn't cash it, didn't rage, didn't even tear it up. He taped it, unspent, inside a file he labeled history, which is another word for things that don't get to drive anymore. He is learning that forgiveness is not an invitation to re-enter, and that gratitude can be grateful to the lesson, not the teacher. I still teach third grade on weekdays and bring the store rhythm with me. On Mondays, we practice toolbox language, replacing "I'm bad at this" with "I need a better plan." And on Fridays, we do a show and tell called Fix This, where repaired zippers and mended friendships share the floor. When the principal asked where I learned it, I said payroll taught me. She laughed and I didn't correct her. After school, I stopped by the original shop, where the floorboard near aisle 4 still sings under my heel, and Dexter's voice carries the patience of a man who knows hurrying a customer's fear will not shorten the conversation. We are less impressive and more dependable than we were a year ago, which is a sentence I want on my headstone. Some nights, when the store is closed and the fluorescents hum like a low morale we no longer accept, I open the office drawer and hold the bracelet Dad wore until the engraving thinned into softness. I touch the tiny notch where his wrist bone insisted on telling the metal who was boss, and I think about the 3 totems that carried us across the worst night of my life. A letter that argued with cruelty until cruelty had to leave. A recorder that turned grief into evidence. And this bracelet that reminds me love has weight and must be worn, not waved. I don't need magic to believe in. I need hardware that fits my hand. Paperwork used to feel like punishment. Now it feels like praise. The prenup held. The estate settled without a courtroom performance. Receipts outstared rumor. We didn't sue, not because we lacked standing, but because we preferred to stand. When a cousin hinted that we should capitalize on the moment with a rebrand, I said the brand is people leaving better than they arrived, and that doesn't need a new font. We did change one thing. The sign above the returns desk now reads, Repairs, Returns, and Second Chances. Folks smile when they see it. I think Dad might too. Holbrook remains our quiet weather vane. He visits quarterly, sips the coffee no one can convince him to like, and listens more than he speaks. When he does talk, sentences arrive already sanded and sealed. He told us once, leaning his elbows on the counter like any other man at ease, that law at its best is a dignified fence around the garden you're trying to grow. I told him legacy at its best is the fruit you share over that fence. He smiled and looked at the bracelet and said something about how Sterling would be pleased to see us haggling over metaphors instead of survival. To camera, to the people who stayed through our story because they recognized their own, I know what it feels like to be told you aren't real at the exact moment you most need to be. I know the way rumor can become a meal for a hungry room, and how a single measured voice, on paper, on audio, across a counter, can change not just an afternoon, but an orbit. If you're choosing family today instead of inheriting it, if you're taping together a map no one left you, if you're sweeping a corner no one claimed, and calling that love, then you are the proof. We needed, and I'm grateful you're here. Stories that prove love beats DNA are not soft. They carry torque. When I lie awake, I replay our arc because repetition makes rituals sturdy. Betrayal taught me that silence can bruise. Exposure taught me that evidence is a tenderness you prepare in advance. Justice taught me that dignity can wear a hard hat. Transformation, slow and imperfect, taught me that showing up is louder than speeches. Paper, audio, stubborn love, that's how we crossed. We are not finished. That feels less like a warning and more like a permission slip to keep building. The key on the high shelf waits. We are growing. We will reach. And when we do, I won't open the 5th-year letter in a panic or as a stunt. I will open it in the same kitchen where he taught us budgets and mercy, with the bracelet on the table and the recorder in a drawer that no longer needs guarding, and with Dexter sitting across from me because the story requires both of us now. I'll say it the way promises want to be said, out loud, accountable, with witnesses who can call me back if I forget. On the 5th anniversary, I'll open Sterling's last letter, and if it changes everything again, will you be here to hear it? If this story hit home, tap like so more people can find it, and tell me in the comments if you've ever seen love, not DNA, hold a family together. Share this with one person who needs proof that receipts beat rumors. Subscribe and hit